over here we get into the classical Shirvan type of rug. I would suggest that the Shirvan rugs are primarily Azeri Turks. Okay? You know, I've been working with the Summers Institute of Linguistics. They don't know how I do this, but I think in the last edition of the ethnologue, the way we work it is, I send suggestions to them. They put my suggestions before a peer review panel, a blind peer review, so they don't know who's making the suggestion. And then they either accept or reject. I believe they accepted 8 of my suggestions for the last ethnologue. And in this, I've been using rugs to define languages. At the same time, I'm using languages to define rugs. Recently, they moved the Gurus Bijar language group from one Turkish group, from one Kurdish group to the other group, basically because I suggested that it had to be so, and they ended up agreeing with me. We've done a couple other languages, and it's worked out fairly well. Anyway, this idea that we can look now to the languages to define the rugs and the rugs to define the languages works out well. When I see flat back, very little depression, white wool wefts, white wool side cords made up out of the wefts, I would suggest that this is Azeri. You know, today I'm painting with a fairly broad brush. I see it in terms of, I'm trying to nail down the major groups, much like we did with the Turkmens, the difference between a Teki and a Yomud and a Chodor. I'm not quite ready to get into the Emreli Eagle group, Goklan controversy. You know, I'm not nearly at that level, and I think it's going to take some time to define these things. But I'm suggesting that, again, this is another one of the rugs. It's slightly more depressed than we see in some of the Shirvans, but with a white back, it has a 1 chord, and I'm not sure. Oh, do you know what that is? Do you know if it's original?
Something.
Yeah.
It may not be.
Anyway, we're going to be hashing through a lot of these issues, but I think that this is another one of the Azeri group. Questions, anyone?
Barry, as far as the Kufic border on that last one,
Yes.
I mean, is that consistent with Azeri, or is it specific at all to? It's usually more it's Kuba.
It's frequently seen in Kuba rugs. On the other hand, I believe that many of these rugs, that there's a closeness between these people. We know that in many of these areas, Lesgi people and Azeri people are living very close to each other. There's got to be a lot of trading back and forth of designs. I was quite disappointed. I got an email, crack of dawn this morning. I had to get up at 4 o'clock to drive down here from Pennsylvania. And when I was checking my email, there was a note from Wendell Swan that he was suffering from a sinus infection and not feeling well and was going to miss today. And I'm disappointed because we had been discussing Zaqatala rugs. Now, I think Zaqatala is one of the more interesting areas of the Caucasus. And one of the reasons why I think Zaqatala is interesting is because they didn't weave a lot of rugs. And what I mean by that is Zaqatala has never been a major weaving center as compared to the other areas. And the biggest reason is Zaqatala is the center of the silk trade in the Caucasus. So a woman who wished to supplement her income would raise silkworms and could make more money raising silkworms than by raising rugs. By weaving rugs. So then we end up with less reliance on the weaving trade, and consequently, I believe, less commercial influence. The market dictates what sells. We talked about why a Kufic border is on a rug that I think is Azeri. Well, there is a tendency that if something sells, like we saw recently, well, with the movie Gabe, which is going to be shown here this afternoon, Gabes have become insanely popular. The Qashqai have virtually stopped weaving traditional rugs and are almost completely weaving Qashqai Gabes now. The traditional older-fashioned tribal rug that we see the Qashqai weave is just disappearing from the marketplace in Iran. And they're weaving these rugs because they can weave them faster. And as soon as they started making money on it, then all the other weaving groups, and you see them from India, and you see them from Turkey, and you see them from all over Iran, you see them from Khorasan province, different places. There's a tendency that if something sells, copy it. But when there's not a market influence, when you're making a rug for yourself, then you weave maybe what your mother wove, what your grandmother wove, what you feel comfortable with. There's less pressure to compete in a marketplace. Zakatalas tend to have that. They're not weaving to be sold to the Russians or the Europeans or anybody else. They were woven mostly for themselves. Now this piece comes out of a collection in Northern California. And what struck me was that I noticed this border, which we see in rugs that I'm calling Armenian, from the Borchula area, and other clues. And looking at this, and this is a provocative thought, I was wondering, besides being a classical Zakatala, could it also be an Armenian Zakatala? We know Armenians lived in Zakatala. Could they have woven rugs when we see something that harkens to a different area? The weave is traditional. It's got the right spin that we would expect. It's got, oh, thank you. It's got they're soft rugs. They're very soft rugs. They've got soft black wool wefts. The handle on them is fantastic, but it's distinctive. So we end up with these rugs, and I'm wondering, could this have been the product of an Armenian in Zakatala? Because I believe that there are other rugs that do not look like Kazakhs that are Armenian. Because we know that Armenians have been weaving for a long time, or at least I'm proposing it and supposing it. But without Wendell here, we don't have his Zakatala to compare. But Austin was kind enough to bring in from his collection his Zakatala.